Rick Habels had asked if we could record this just. Okay with that.
Sure.
Sure.
We might even ask for a copy at
Yeah, I
some
would.
point.
Right, exactly.
Should have
Depends
told
what
you.
goes on.
Anyway, all right, so we'll just go ahead and start over here, so.
I'm Sharon Friedman. I'm the Director of Planning here in the Rocky Mountain region.
Oh, and I forgot myself, I'm
Yeah.
Joan Friedlander, and I work for Sharon Friedman in the planning shop, so. Mark?
I'm Mark Spilacci. I teach at the University of Colorado Law School, and I'm the director of the Natural Resources Law Center there.
Hi, I'm Fred Cheever. I teach at the University of Denver, and I'm the director of the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Center there.
He's one-upping me already.
I'm Allison Kinsey, and I'm a 3L at DU Law.
I'm Ward Scott. I'm also a 3L at DU Law.
David Mason, 2L at DU.
Pete Johnson. I'm a 2L at DU too.
Lisa Dawson, I'm a 2L at DU as well.
Teresa Corliss, I'm an LLM student at DU.
Stu Gillespie. I'm a 1L at CU Law School.
Bob Gregory, I'm a 1L at CU Law School.
Michael Kopp, I'm a 1L at CU Law School.
Ryan Knight, I'm a 2L at CU Law School.
And I'm Lauren Riss. I work at the Natural Resource Law Center with Mark Hennessy.
I'm Tom Ford, and I work for Sharon Friedman here in the planning shop.
John Roop, I'm also working for Sharon. I do forest planning here.
Okay, so should I be saying I'm a 25L for? All right, Fred, I'm gonna let you introduce yourself, and then Sharon, you can kick this off.
Okay.
Okay, and I'm gonna sit back. I'm gonna apologize for this. I'm gonna have to leave before this is over, and Tom Ford's gonna take over as far as helping out here.
So Fred, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Is this, I'm getting the picture that this is connected with the class somehow. Is that correct?
Well, not exactly. We've been just having discussions with folks, with these folks, sort of ongoing discussions about topics of mutual interest, with the goal being to have some kind of practitioner, legal professor, legal student interaction.
Oh, good idea.
Right. This is unstructured interaction.
Yeah, pretty unstructured.
Okay. Well, I guess you've probably heard, my name is Fred Norbury, and I guess the reason I'm talking to you today is because I have been involved with the planning rule that we issued back in 2005, and have now got reissued for comment in the wake of a court decision. I have to point out that a couple of people there in the room with you have been almost as involved in it as I have all the way along. Sharon was involved at a particularly critical juncture in developing part of the rule, and John's been there ever since the beginning. And is John Roop? I think that's John back in the back.
Yep.
Yeah.
So they can provide additional details on anything I say after we're done, and could also you can compare their recollections of what happened with mine. In any complex venture that lasted multiple years, people ended up having the holes of different parts of the elephant. It's kind of interesting to me to be able to talk to attorneys again, because in the course of my normal work, I don't really talk to attorneys routinely, although I have done quite a lot. What I thought I would do today, though, is run through with you basically what I had to say when I met with the judges of the 8th and 10th Circuit Judicial Conference out of Vail. So the way I'll run through this today really is aimed at people with a legal background. It's not quite the same thing I would say if I were dealing with a Forest Service audience or general public audience. I won't be exactly the same as what I said to the judges, but it'll be probably the same logic. The interesting thing to me is that in the Forest Service, we do get sued a lot, as you guys probably know, and we lose occasionally. We actually do win the majority of our cases. Most people don't realize that because losses, it's just like plane crashes, they attract a lot more attention than the planes that land on time. But as a result, a lot of people in the Forest Service, a lot of people who hear about the Forest Service think of the judiciary as something that is from time to time an obstacle for the Forest Service. When I tell the story of the planning rule, the hero of the story, if there is one, is actually the Supreme Court. My own personal belief is that for 20 years in the Forest Service, we were going down the wrong road in planning. And the Supreme Court is the one who actually pointed out the error of our ways. And they did that by asking a question, a very simple question that we hadn't asked because we thought it was too simple and we thought the answer was obvious. And I'll get back to what they had to say, what that question was in a minute. I don't know what your background is on the National Forest Management Act. I assume if you're interested in these things, you know where that came from, out of the lawsuit on Monongahela National Forest back in the 70s over clear cutting. And so you know generally what the requirements of that law are. I was actually in graduate school when that law passed, and was taking a course from Dennis Teagarden, who was one of the professors on the original Committee of Scientists. And it's very interesting to me because Dennis would go to the meetings of the Committee of Scientists and then come back and complain about the Forest Service rejecting all the great advice that he was offering. So it was really very interesting to me to see it from his point of view. And then immediately after graduate school, I went to work for the Forest Service doing planning, trying to implement the regulation, and got a chance to see it from the other side of the table. I thought when I got out of graduate school that I understood the law and the regulations, but I think I didn't really start learning until I became a planner. I started as a planner on the Umatilla National Forest in eastern Oregon. You know, at the time, the Forest Service was still almost an innocent planning. We thought that plans would take, a year or two to finish, and it might cost $1 million total. But what we quickly learned is that plans were taking, we didn't quickly learn, it took a while to learn this, plans were routinely taking 5 to 7 years to finish, costing about $1 million a year. Extreme case is the Tongass plan, which is, the revision of the Tongass plan, which actually started in 1987, is not done yet, and is going to push $30 million before it's finally done. So we learned that planning, I think, was a lot harder than what we thought, and a lot harder than what anybody had expected. The other thing we learned, I think, was kind of surprising. We learned that the planning process itself actually discouraged public involvement. Just the length of time and the complexity of the process made it very, very difficult for average people to participate. The one quote that we heard actually more than once was from a young mother who said, you know, there's only so many times I could go get a babysitter and go down to the latest Forest Service meeting on the plan on Tuesday night. And I remember personal conversations with some of the leaders of Alaska Natives in Alaska when I worked in Alaska in planning. They said, you know, you guys come around every year and you ask us the same questions and we tell you the same thing, and then you go back and work for another year. Come back when you're done. They really actually tended to fall out of the process. The other thing we learned was unexpected was that the courts changed the nature of the planning process while it was being implemented. The Forest Service had thought, perhaps naively but sincerely, that you could do a plan and it was worth doing a plan because once you've done a plan, then you could write an EIS on the plan and that would cover your projects. And then you could go implement the projects. And so it would be an efficient and effective way to comply with NEPA. Well, the courts didn't see it that way. The courts increasingly required EISs or EAs on our projects. And regardless of what had been done at the plan level, so we weren't getting the economies associated with NEPA compliance that we expected out of the plans. So this was the essential dilemma that became apparent pretty early on in this process, is that planning was taking a lot longer and costing a lot more than what we expected. The length and the complexity of the planning process was creating a barrier to involvement in planning by ordinary people. And the plans weren't buying us very much in terms of being better able to do projects. So the Forest Service actually realized this early on and set out to rewrite the regulations. The first proposed draft of the regulations came out in 1992. The first regulations were in 79. They were replaced by the regulations in 82 that were in force. By 1992, the Forest Service had put, 10 years later, had put an alternative proposal on the street. There was another draft regulation that came out in 97, revised draft regulations in 99, and then final regulations came out in 2000. And it was in 2000, so the 2000 regulations replaced the regulations that had been adopted back in 1982. And that was a juncture in which I was invited to come back from where I was in Alaska to the Washington office to begin implementing the 2000 regulations. I think my reaction to those 2000 regulations was similar to the reactions of a lot of planners in the Forest Service at the time. There were a lot of things about those regulations that we liked. We liked the emphasis on sustainability, we liked the emphasis on public involvement, and we liked the emphasis on science in those regulations. But in spite of that, we were worried, and the problem we had was we thought the regulations were essentially backward-looking. They were written to control a timber program that didn't exist anymore. If you think about it, when we got involved with the National Forest Management Act planning, the timber program in the National Forest was around 12 billion feet per year. By 2000, that program had shrunk to 2 billion feet a year, so it had shrunk by over 80%. The National Forests were really not pursuing timber harvesting as a goal per se. The emphasis had shifted. The ecosystem management had shifted to restoration. The problems we were facing on the National Forest were things like invasive species, fire. In 1993, fire was 13% of our budget, and it was climbing ever since. Just to frame it, in the President's budget for this year, fire suppression will consume half the National Forest budget. Uncontrolled recreation had exploded on our forest. We had more powerful OHVs covering more land, going deeper into the forest than ever before. Those are the kinds of problems that were really facing the managers, and were not the kind of problems that the regulations addressed. The worst cause of our worry, though, was we thought that these new regulations, the 2000 regulations, hadn't addressed the central problem we faced as planners. They didn't make plans any easier to accomplish. In fact, we thought they were going to make plans harder to get done, because the planning process, instead of becoming simpler, had become much more complex and much more time-consuming. Well, this is where the Supreme Court comes into the story. It actually occurred back in 1997 with the Ohio Forestry case. And if you've been following litigation on the National Forest, you're probably familiar with it. For us, the key finding in that case was that the court said a plan, after all, is just a plan. It says it does not command anyone to do anything or to refrain from doing anything. The plan does not give anyone a legal right to cut trees, nor does it abolish anyone's legal authority to object to trees being cut. And it goes on in that vein for some length. Now, the more we thought about it, the more we realized that the Supreme Court was right, and that we hadn't really, back in the early 80s, thought very much about a plan. We initially had thought that a plan was simply 10 or 15 years worth of projects. You pile up 10 or 15 years worth of projects, you write an EIS of the whole batch, and then you'd be done. I actually checked this out by going and talking to Dennis Teagarden and asking him personally, what did you guys think the plan was? He said, we thought these were his words. We thought it was simply 10 or 15 years worth of projects. We know that answer is wrong because we don't do those projects. We actually have discovered that we end up doing very few of the actual activities that are contemplated in the plan. Too much changes over a 10 to 15 year life of a plan. The budgets are different, the kinds of issues that come up are different. Species get listed that weren't listed under the Endangered Species Act when you started the plan. You get more data on both on the resources and on the interactions between the resources. Any detailed planning that purports to last for 15 years is going to become obsolete very quickly. To be useful, we realize that a plan really has to be strategic in nature. So that the more we thought about it, the more we realized was the valuable part of a plan was the part of a plan that established goals. We discovered that we also discovered that when you ask people to talk about goals, it had created a subtle but important change in the dynamic of your conversation. When you talk about activities, people tend to focus on detail, they tend to focus on what they don't like, and talking about all those 10 or 15 years worth of activities is divisive. But we discovered when you start asking people, what do you want the land to look like 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now? They have a lot more in common than they realize. And the kind of dialogue that you can engage in with the public is much more productive. So with that in mind, we actually redefined what a plan was. We said a plan's got three pieces. It's got goals for what you want the land to look like in the long run. Got some guidelines that you need to follow when you design projects that you think will take you toward those goals. And it's got to have monitoring provisions so you can tell how well you're doing in making progress toward the goals. That is, in essence, what a plan needs to be. Well, with that framework, we ask ourselves, well, if that's what a plan is, if it's goals and guidelines and monitoring requirements, does it make sense to write an EIS for a plan? Now, we could ask that question because NFMA creates a special authority for the Secretary of Agriculture to determine how to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act in the course of planning. So we said, our first question was, well, is an EIS useful? And our conclusion was that the EISs that we were writing for plans weren't very useful. They were speculating about activities that, in fact, never occurred. And worse, when it came time to write the EISs and the EAs for the projects, there wasn't much information in those plan-level EISs that we could draw on. Some of it was because the plan-level EISs were far too broad. The more important issue was the plan-level EISs were old. If you think about it, if a plan's going to last for 15 years, you don't get very far into the lifespan of a plan before the EIS that you did for that plan has become functionally obsolete. So in the regulations that we issued in 2005, and in the proposed regulations that are on the street right now, we have said we wouldn't do an EIS. Here's where the attorneys jump back into the picture. I think our original strategy was we'd simply not do an EIS. And the attorneys said, well, you can't just not do an EIS. You only get one of three choices. You have to do an EIS, an EA, or a CE. We said, well, okay, well, if those are our choices, we'll do a CE. And that's how we arrived at that decision. Now, the public reaction to not doing an EIS has been very interesting to me. The immediate reaction is, well, if you're not doing an EIS, you must not be doing any public involvement. And that's just wrong. What people fail to realize is the National Forest Management Act creates its own public involvement requirements that in some ways are even more exacting than the public involvement requirements of NEPA. And regulations that we issued amplify on the public involvement requirements that are in statute. And we think we've got public involvement involvement requirements that are every bit as good as anything that you would get from simple applications of the CEQ regulations. We also think that the public involvement process that we've created with our regulations is actually better in some respects than what exists in the CEQ regs. The CEQ regs, in our view, are written under a 1950s concept of notice and comment, which is basically we do something, we offer it to the public offers comments, we compile their comments, and think about them, and then decide. That's the classic model that's used in rulemaking and NEPA. What that tends to create is people retreating behind piles of paper and throwing paper across the transom. What we've found is that you're better off if you get people in the room talking about what's going on. And that's the kind of process that we've tried to create with our planning regulations. And to distinguish that from public participation, as is commonly understood, we call it collaboration. And that is required in the regulations and spelled out. The other thing people jump to is they say, well, if you're not doing any EIS, you must not be doing any analysis. And again, that's just plain wrong. The statute in FMA has its own analysis requirements, and they're substantive requirements as opposed to the procedural requirements that you find in NEPA. And again, the regulations amplify those substantive requirements and creates something that we think is useful. It not only requires analysis to be done when the plan is initially adopted or revised, but requires systematic updating of that analysis throughout the life of the plan, rather than creating something that will grow old and be static over the 15-year life of the plan. There are some other differences between what we've done and what's in these new regulations and what exists in the 82 regulations, and we can go into that now. We actually have some grounds for optimism about the regulations. While we were writing the regs before they came out, there was another Supreme Court case that persuaded us that maybe the 87 decision on Ohio forestry was not just a fluke. This is the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance decision where, once again, it was a BLM case and not a National Forest case, but the statute under which the BLM does its planning is very similar to NFMA. And once again, the Supreme Court said, these are my words, a plan is, after all, just a plan. It doesn't bring about any change in the physical reality that exists out there. There are some grounds for pessimism as well. The first time these new regulations went into court, we lost. It was in the Ninth Circuit. The judge basically faulted us on several grounds. One of them is that she thought that we made too many changes between our proposed regulations and the final regulations. Thought we should write an EIS on the plan. And so we have written an EIS in the plan and have gone out for notice and comment, a formal notice and comment period on the regulations. So we'll see what happens. If we're successful in getting final regulations out this fall, it will have taken us 22 years to rewrite the NFMA planning regulations. And the conclusions I draw from that is that if planning's hard, writing planning regulations is even harder. We think that we've written good regulations here. We think we've created a planning process that you can get through that will actually result in completed plans. We think it carves out an appropriate role for the public. We think it emphasizes sustaining the land, and it has an appropriate involvement of science as well. We hope that ultimately these regulations will be sustained by the courts. If they're not, this my conclusion, this is a very personal conclusion, is that I think it will be time for us to go back and take another look at NFMA and see if the statute itself is the appropriate statute for the situation that the forests face in the 21st century. And maybe that's enough for now, and I'll take any questions or comments or counter arguments And are those Rick Cable's feet I see at the left of the screen?
Yeah, Fred. How you doing, Fred?
Amazing that I can recognize your feet, Rick.
Good job.
So,
Let me first ask Sharon. Sharon, you were around. I did not talk about environmental management systems, which I think is one of the most interesting features of our new regulations. Sharon's an expert on that. And in terms of the basic concepts of what a plan is, in terms of goals and guidelines and monitoring requirements, John Root, back there at the back of the room, is one of the intellectual authors of that concept. So I would invite both of those to help respond to any questions you might have.
well, go ahead.
Flip
You
a
gonna
coin?
start, Fred? Go
Sure,
ahead.
I'll start. Okay, well, first, thank you for inviting us all out here. I think this is a great idea. Second, I'm not here as an attorney. I have no clients. I'm here as a friend. There is no federal agency I respect nearly as much as the United States Forest Service. Third, what can you reasonably expect from lawyers? And this is a question I'm sure you've dealt with for the last 30 years. And I'll use a metaphor which is particularly relevant in Colorado right now. We're umpires, right? That's all we do. We can't tell you how to plan, and we certainly can't tell you how to manage land. But we can help you know what rules Congress has imposed. And you say, quite reasonably sometimes, the rules Congress imposes can be crazy. And we don't require Congress to be wise, we just require them to be elected. And that's a right they have. So I think there were two lost stories that are relevant here. And the first lost story is the story of NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which was passed in 1969, signed on January 1st, 1970. And what it's about is requiring federal agencies to think about the environmental consequences of their decisions at the earliest possible time. Because the bunch of politicians who drafted it understood decision-making as well as any of us. And what they understood is the earlier that the analysis associated with environmental impacts gets generated, the more influence it's going to have, both on the internal agency decision-making process, which is collaborative and goes by accretion, as we all know, and the external political process, of which it's a larger part. In the 1970s, the first big EISs were all about programmatic activities. The general understanding of the law from the point of view of the folks who were there was that the place you really wanted to start was with programmatic activities. And we could talk a lot about the language in the NFMA regarding NEPA, but it's worth saying that there weren't any categorical exclusions in 1976 when that language was passed. So I think it's pretty easy to argue that what Congress had in mind, and I admit it's 37 years ago and it seems like a lot more mileage than years, was that this process be undertaken early so it had the maximum chance of influencing decision-making. And I think that plays into the current situation with the categorical exclusion and both the 2005 and 2007 rules. And I think it's hard to defend promulgating an identical set of rules twice. And I think it's going to be tough when the EIS you've done to support it doesn't include bodies of data that you have available. You have, as you point out, been doing planning longer than anybody else. You know more about planning than anybody else. And there are things you don't like about the 1982 rules, and there are things I don't like about the 1982 rules. And I think everybody who's involved in the process has found them incredibly frustrating. But it concerns me how little of that experience appears in that EIS. Okay, before I shut up, the other story. The other story is the NFMA. right? And thank you for bringing it up. The NFMA is largely the fruit of the Monongahela case. What I think most people would accept were the outmoded provisions of the Forest Service Organic Act of 1897 and general changes that were taking place in the 1970s, among them the fact that suddenly citizens felt they could go to court and sue for violations of the federal law. But there's a word that appears in the NFMA again and again and again, and that word is standards. And if you go back to the legislative history of the NFMA, pretty clearly it's a compromise where the Forest Service gets to plan, and they get to plan fairly broadly without a whole lot of rules. But there's a laundry list of specific things. We all wish they were more specific, no matter which side of the fence you're on. We all wish they were more specific. Things that those planning regulations have to assure against, right? They have to ensure for relatively wise timber harvest, which of course was the issue back then. They have to protect soil. They have to deal with biological diversity and a variety of other things. And by setting up a series of planning rules that wisely or unwisely essentially give up the notion of standards, I think you do put yourself at odds with the NFMA. And we could certainly talk about whether it's still the statute you need. That's another question. But I think it's tough to argue that these regs are consistent with the intent of that statute. So I'll toss it off to Mark.
Okay, and I really think it'd be great if we could let everybody have a chance to talk. I'll try to be as brief as I can, but I do want to make several points and maybe just offer kind of an outline of some other things we can talk about. And I want to join Fred in thanking you folks for hosting us and talking with us. I think this is really valuable. Like Fred, I'm not here as a lawyer, or at least not one interested in litigating. I mean, unlike Fred, I guess I would say that I don't view myself here just as an umpire. I'm not interested in the balls and strikes here or nitpicking on violations of the act. I do think that as lawyers and as people engaged in studying the law, we can help to come up with good policy. That is part of our role in society, and that we ought to use that. So I don't want to quibble too much about the law. We have to live with it. As Fred points out, it's there, and we can't ignore what it says. Three different, I guess, aspects of the issue that I'd like to talk about, or at least raise as issues that we might explore in more detail. First, I hesitate almost to bring this up, but I think it's important, and that's the politics of this whole issue. We're 18 months away or so from a new administration, and as things are progressing right now, it's hard for me to think that you all are going to be able to finish this process within the next 18 months. You may come out with rules in the fall. I would be willing to bet, as sure as we're sitting here, that you're going to be sued on the 2005 planning rules, probably NEPA being the chief issue. And I think you're going to lose. I mean, it's just my prediction, but I think we should talk about NEPA in a bit, but I don't think you're going to fare very well on the NEPA issue, which will almost certainly mean that this goes into the next administration, and that'll have to be addressed there. And if that happens, we're likely to see another sort of major effort. And so I guess one thing to start, I'd like to suggest that maybe the politics counsels against rushing into a final decision here. Maybe it counsels in, stepping back and realizing that it's probably not going to get resolved by this administration, at least not finally, and that we have the luxury of maybe trying to get it right this time. And I'm not sure what that means. We may have differences of opinion about what's right, but I do think we're not there yet with this set of proposals. Second point is the NEPA process and issues surrounding the NEPA process. And I don't want to overstate this or sound unfair or angry or mean, but this draft EIS, to my mind, is really a piece of garbage. And I say that, I've read a lot of EISs over the years. I've looked at lots of them. And what I sense from this EIS is an agency that threw something together because the court insisted that they do it. I guess there was sort of a call made, should we appeal? Should we just do the EIS? And the call was made to do the EIS. And if you look at the EIS, and I hope we'll talk about this some more, I mean, you kind of set out these straw men as alternatives. There's a few tweaks on your 2005 rules. You've set up the 1982 rules and the 2000 rules as alternatives. But if you read your own document, you're not seriously looking at either the 82 rules or the 2000 rules as reasonable alternatives. Some of us might say that they are, but I mean, I've read the document, and those aren't being treated as reasonable alternatives. You're quite critical of particularly the 2000 rules and why they wouldn't work. They don't work for you. So, you know, if we look at the sort of the universe of reasonable alternatives, it strikes me that we're just not there yet. Now, regarding this whole question of alternatives in the NEPA process, I would like for us to have some discussion, but I want to say that I am very sympathetic to the point that you made, Fred, and that I think has generally been made by many people in the forest planning business, and that is that our previous way, I should say, of doing planning under the old rules, mostly the 82 rules, wasn't working. It was too complex. It was taking too long. It was too nitpicky. The standards and guidelines went on and on and on, and if you wanted to litigate on them, you could, because they were so nitpicky that you'd surely find something to litigate about. And they did, I think, mean that people couldn't meaningfully get involved in the process because it was just overwhelming. You used to pick up one of those old plans with the EIS and your eyes would glaze over because it was just too much information. And it wasn't necessary. I mean, you know, all these standards and guidelines for timber sales that were never going to occur. And if they did occur, they might be 10 years later when our knowledge of the area and everything else is different, so that, you know, relying on that old analysis didn't help. It didn't make any sense. The standards wouldn't make sense. You'd have to amend the plan anyway. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm with you folks on a need to sort of find a different way. But I'm not persuaded that the 2005 rules are that different way, or that we ought not at least be looking at some other possibilities that might accomplish some of the needs that you've expressed in terms of having these things done more quickly at a reasonable cost, and in a way that is accessible to the public. And so, you know, I guess the third thing I'd like to talk about, and I'll try to be quiet then and let other people come in, is just the planning rules themselves, the way you've approached this. And here you know, I have to confess that I'm not sure I understand the rules. I certainly don't pretend to understand environmental management systems, although they were designed really for industry, and it seems to me a bit of a round peg in a square hole problem to try to shoehorn EMS into a planning process. But I'm willing to be educated about how this would work here. But you know, but what has struck me about at least what the Forest Service has said about the 2005 planning rules is that they're aspirational, they're strategic, they're not deciding anything. And you know, I kind of throw up my hands, and I'm not asking you to decide every nitpicking little standard that might happen if in fact you decide to do a timber sale or allow oil and gas development or whatever it is. But I do think that you've got to make some decisions in a forest plan, decisions that, you know, are subject to challenge, decisions that commit you to do or not do certain things, whether SUA, and we can argue about what SUA means and what Ohio forestry means, but again, I'm not sure that it's worth quibbling about that. If we think about this just in the broader policy perspective, we ought to be able to make basic kinds of choices about where we're going to allow logging, where we're going to allow off-road vehicle use or not allow off-road vehicle use, where we're going to allow oil and gas development, grazing. All these choices have to be made. They ought to be, that ought to be the purpose of the plan. Now, I don't know whether you envision doing the zoning kinds of maps that you used to do with the plans, but if you're going to do that, then, and you reread SUA, you will see that those are binding choices that you're making, and those are not merely aspirational. Those are decisions not to log in certain areas, or to manage an area for primitive recreation, which means no motorized vehicle use. Those are choices that you've made, and I think they're important to make them. You know, if I were sort of thinking about other alternatives, I'd like to see, you know, some spelling out of how these sort of at least basic choices might be made in planning rules, and I'd also like to see some discussion of overlays. on the basic kind of zoning maps. I'd love to see some discussion of what a landscape management sort of system might look as an overlay on the zones that you might have. You might also overlay, recreational management and other kinds of management tools. But I do think that there is a rich suite of opportunities to sort of look from a planning perspective, not from a nitpicking standards and guidelines. And I know there are requirements for standards in the law that would have to be honored, but the requirements are pretty generic and I don't think would pin you down too much. I guess what I'm saying is I think that there are other ways to accomplish a lot of what you want to accomplish, but to do it in a way that gives the public a better sense of what the choices are that the forest wants to make for a particular forest. And I'd love to be able to discuss and see a better sort of evaluation or look at that. And maybe you all think that your current plans or rules do that, but I don't see it. So I'll stop and let other people talk.
Well, let me ask a question. Have you seen the kinds of plans we're developing under the new rules?
Well,
several came to the draft level. There are a couple of them that were started fresh after the regulation passed, actually pretty good representations of what our vision of a plan would be. And what we found is that people like them, and that people think that they do paint the kind of picture that you're looking for about what is going to happen out there. In fact, they don't look that much different than the plans that we've done now.
Well, and Fred, I'm not sure that I've seen certainly some recent plans, but it all seems to have been sort of caught up in the change, and I guess I'm not aware of particular plans that might have been done strictly under the 2005 rules. I do sense that that's what you're doing, but that's not how I read the 2005 rules. And I guess, part of the problem for me is that everything in the 2005 rules is, to my mind, totally process-oriented. There's not a substantive bone in that body there that I find. And so, I don't see any obligation on your part to make choices about how you're going to manage particular tracts of land or zones of land or, areas that you might be dealing with. I don't see specific requirements for how you're going to deal with species issues as they arise on the forest. I guess that's what I'd like to see. It may be that the plans ultimately evolve in that way, but all we've got right now is the planning rules and the EIS, which to my mind is so bare bones that it doesn't really help me sort of see how you're going with this kind of stuff. So, it may be that what you're doing would make me feel better about the rules, but maybe the rules need to conform better to what you're doing, if that makes sense.
What's a good plan to look at? What are you really proud of that's out there right now?
You won't be offended, Fred, if it's not a Region 2 plan.
Actually, the one that is probably easiest to look at is maybe the Uwharrie plan in North Carolina. So it's a small forest, so it's fairly accessible. There's some plans that are done in Region 1 that I think were started fresh after the rule passed that represent what we're looking for: the Lolo, the Flathead. I can't remember. There's two more, but I'm not sure. I can't. John may know.
Northern Idaho, Panhandle.
Panhandle, Fred?
Yeah, Panhandle's one. And I remember actually going and meeting in Missoula with people who've been, with planners and with people who've been involved in the development of both the Lolo and Flathead plans. And they talked about, some of them had been involved in earlier planning efforts, and they talked about how much better this planning effort was and how much better they felt about the plans because they could understand finally what we really intended. So I really do think you need to round out your picture. I think, I don't know whether you need to or not, it'd be helpful to round out your picture, to look at the kinds of plans that these rules are actually producing.
Can I just ask you a question, Fred, from what you've said about one of these plans? Now, presumably, you said they look somewhat like the old plan, so you do make choices about, for example, where you're going to allow logging or not allow it, or where you're going to allow new roads or whatever you're doing. You're, in other words, you're setting a management prescription for these areas. Is that fair?
Yes, they are.
Okay, so, I mean, I guess how do you argue then, even under SUA? I don't understand how you argue that you're not making decisions. In other words, if you have let's suppose you chose to put 2/3 of the Lolo off limits to logging, and the timber company wanted to say, well, under Ohio forestry, they might not be able to sue that on that until you did it. But if you chose to limit off-road vehicle use, Ohio forestry makes clear that if you've made choices to open areas to off-road vehicles in your plan, there's no other permit decision that is needed before people go in and use their off-road vehicles. So Justice Breyer says you can sue on that. I mean, so I guess my point is you've made decisions. This is not just aspirational or strategic. This is a commitment that under NEPA is an action that, to my mind, you've got to analyze under NEPA.
Let's just deal with OHVs, because that's a very, very interesting example. And first off, I've never said, and you'll never hear me say it, that plans don't make decisions. Plans do make decisions. The question is, what kind of decision is it? And whether it's that decision represents a major federal action with effects on the human environment, with effects that can be meaningfully evaluated, which is the NEPA test. But OHVs, under the current rule, are typically not decided in the plan, even under 82. Now, we started out back even in 79 thinking the plans were going to decide finally what areas were open and closed for off-road vehicle use. And then once the plan decision was signed, that decision on the permitting the vehicles was done. And presumably if you had closed an area and someone took their vehicle in there, you could pop it for violating a final decision of the Forest Service. What we discovered, even under the 82 rules, is that you simply can't make that final decision in the plan. It's too hard. It requires data that's way too site-specific, so that characteristically, and I think in recent years, 100% of the time, what the plans do under the 82 rules is indicate our intent with respect to having areas open or closed. Then you have to, before you can close an area, you have to follow up with site-specific analysis, with public involvement, and make an appropriate NEPA disclosure, and make a final decision. So in that respect, our treatment of OHVs under the new rule is not at all different from the way we've treated OHVs at present under the 1982 rule.
In fact, let me just add that that's exactly what we did on the White River National Forest. We separated the travel management decision from the forest plan because of the very reasons Fred described.
So what happens in the interim before you have your travel management plan? If someone wants to go in with their off-road vehicle?
Well, you usually are, in all cases in this region, we had previous travel management plans. And that's what guides until you update the travel management plan.
So you're operating under the plan as opposed to, under the travel management plan as opposed to the land use plan.
Well, the new plan, the revised plan, had to be, it has to be compatible and consistent with the previous travel management plan. If you make a change, you had to change that aspect of the travel management. But in terms of comprehensively doing a travel management plan, we typically separate it for the reasons Fred just described under the 82 rule.
Plus, we have a new travel management rule, which requires that that we develop maps of the existing roads and then declare them. So, and different forests have different processes. John's the expert on this. But the idea is that nationally we decided closed unless open. And so now we have a process that we're working through to map the existing roads. And that's completely separate from the planning process, except to the extent that like they're saying, if an area is generally zoned in a plan, not for that, that's not where you would be. That's not where you'd be doing things.
Actually, can I ask one more question, and then let's hear from some other people. I mean, you talked earlier about the moms who got tired of going out Tuesday nights to the planning process, and we all know a lot of those people. But my experience with those people is that what finally upset them was after 4 or 5 years of doing it, they said, the plan doesn't mean anything, right? They said, we put in all this time, and the process we were part of didn't involve commitments. And that in a lot of forest communities, the sense of frustration with the old planning process isn't that there was too much commitment, it was that there wasn't enough.
Yeah, but I think that's accurate with respect to, particularly with respect to commodity outputs. A lot of people believed when we started in-family planning that a plan would do, for example, would decide upon a timber output level, and that represented a commitment by the Forest Service to provide that timber output level. But we learned early on that simply wasn't going to happen. That the plan set a limit on what you could offer, but it didn't offer any timber, and the plan couldn't be used to compel the Forest Service to offer timber. So there was that kind of frustration in the planning process already. But there are other people who, I guess we had similar kinds of things with some of the other outputs, but maybe that's enough to illustrate the logic.
Well, not only that, but I would also offer that it was more than that, in my view. There were people who just flat did not have the time, period. Whether the decision stuck or not, they didn't have the time. I mean, the only people literally that, in my experience, that could stay through a planning process as we did it under the 82 regs were the paid gladiators that were representing the interest groups. They could stay with it, or the government officials representing other agencies. But regular citizens, which is what you're really doing the plan for, they just was too long, too bureaucratic, too arduous, too many meetings, and I don't think they wanted to stick with anything that long, even if the decisions were, actually if you could implement it. So I think it was partly what you said, Fred, but even more. It just that process was just too long.
Exhaustion played a big part.
Let's let other people in.
So,
Yeah, Lisa.
Could we maybe go up front to make sure that Fred can hear, because I'm not sure he's going to be able to hear from back here. Not to put you on the spot.
We're gonna try a question from the back and see if you can hear.
Yeah, try, because I heard someone telling that person that I wouldn't be able to hear them.
Okay.
My question is really just how much harder would it be in integrating NGMA analysis with an EMS? Only because in looking at the EMS, you already have to evaluate things like the aspects and impacts. And you have factors that you look at that are similar to the CEQ guidelines, such as your biological, social, economic, and ecological impacts, as well as having to communicate with the public. And so I'm curious then, how much more burdensome is it then to do both? Which is not an alternative that you have in your EIS, but to me seems viable, but this is coming from a perspective that hasn't really planned anything ever. So.
Yeah. Well, a lot more burdensome, and if you want to get a sense of that, I'd say just go to a forest that has a plan developed under the 1982 rule, and look at the documents, look at the plan document, then look at the EIS and all its appendices, and just think about the sheer amount of work involved in developing that EIS and all those appendices. And it's hard. Our accounting system doesn't really let us track how much of the spending on planning was for the plan versus the EIS. So we can't give you that. We can give you a gut feeling that, and it's just a gut feeling, 30%, 50% of the cost of planning has been involved in producing that document, which really accounts for the bulk of the paper that got printed in the end. And I, as I said, I wouldn't object to doing those if I thought they were useful, but the problem is all that paper is not proven useful. So that's why that extra burden, even if it were small, is not something I would willingly take on if there was a way, if I could figure out a way to not do it.
Fred, related to that question, how do you plan to consider alternatives for plans? In other words, you're not doing NEPA compliance. How do you consider sort of the conservation alternative, the conservation biology alternative, or the wilderness alternative, or the maximum timber production alternative? What does that look like under the EMS approach?
Well, it's not an EMS approach, it's the NFMA approach. What we're doing, and this is part of the change from notice and comment rulemaking to collaboration. Our experience has been that this requirement for a broad range of alternatives that you carry through the planning process to the end is proven divisive. Because what it does is it encourages people to anchor in on their favorite alternative to preserve their negotiating position and to preserve their litigation position. It doesn't help people get together. So what we're talking about now is what we're calling the iterative development of alternatives. In most cases now, in fact almost all cases, we'll be dealing with revisions of existing plans. And we'll start the process by putting on a table, here's the existing plan, here's how we would propose to change it. What do you think? And as we get comments from people, we'll put various modifications of that proposal on the table. So over the course of the planning process, there's going to be iteratively developed multiple alternatives. But there'll always be the current alternative that's in front of people. So the question will always be to people, what would you like to change in this? And to see what kind of agreement there might be amongst the people who are involved in how they change that. So when you get done, by the end of the process, when we finally arrive at a final plan, there will be this trail of alternatives that were considered over the course of the process. And we thought that would bring people together, and we discovered, in fact, where we've done this, that it worked very, very well.
And I really agree with that. If just as Fred described, when you had a conservation biology alternative like the Medicine Bow, we had the biological or the biodiversity associates offered up an alternative, and then the timber industry / commodity interest offered up an alternative, and then they would become wedded to that alternative, and then we would do the EIS, and we would get comments, and then we would go and we would take pieces and parts and offer up a decision and a record of decision. Okay. Now, the alternative Fred just described is we do that part that we did by ourselves in a forum. So there would be alternatives we'd start with, and then we'd say, well, Stu wants this, and Pete over here says, well, no, we need a little bit more grazing, or you're not taking care of the riparian areas or whatever, and we would modify it, another iteration. And that's how we actually did the Chugach plan. And we did it on the web. So the Chugach plan kept coming up, and people would look at maps on the web, and then we'd tweak it and modify it. And actually the Chugach plan was remarkably, I think, smooth in terms of moving forward. I had left Alaska by then, and Fred left before I did. But so I somehow getting the public involved in actually those changes and modifications. I don't know if this is the best way to do it, but it certainly is a way to do it, and that's really the idea.
Yeah, let me contrast the difference in it. Under the notice and comment model, which we followed under 82, we would take all these comments and then we would work behind closed doors to put together that final alternative that Rick talked about. And so the plan rollout was always a big dramatic event.
That's right.
We would try to keep it secret, and then it would be unveiled, and then the games would begin. And the Chugach, the supervisor there, did something very, I thought, very cool. It was very different. He carried the proposed plan around with him all the time, and he would run into somebody, he'd unroll the map and say, what do you think about this? And as he met with people, with individuals, with groups, progressively, working up to the final decision, there was never any mystery, there was never any secret about what the current plan was on the table. When the time came for the final decision, there wasn't any rollout to happen. Everybody already knew and had known for a long time what was going to happen. And it created a much better relationship with the public.
That's true.
But actually, the GMUG was that way. We had a sort of a setback where we discovered that the way that the GMUG had been written was not really what the idea was for the new rule. So there was one that was posted on the web to the public that was the rolling alternative, and then they kind of rewrote it, and then that got posted on the web too. So everybody could see, oh, this is where they were, and then they decided they were going to change this format this way, and here's what it looks like now.
Stu has a question.
Yeah, I actually had, I guess I would like to understand your logic with the alternatives analysis you've done here in the 2005 rule. I know when you released the 2005 rule, there was a bit of a shock that the EMS was included in there, so that was a bit of a surprise, as I understand. And that's part of the reason why we're at this phase where we're having to do an alternatives analysis. And in the alternatives, you've proposed a rule that includes standards to the 2005 rule, and I just wanted to understand what your rationale for that alternative is and what difference that makes to the rule. So I guess there's kind of two questions there. It seems like you surprised everyone with the 2005 rule, and then I just want to understand your logic with the alternatives analysis.
Okay, you're talking about the alternatives analysis in the rule.
Yeah, the draft GIS, yeah.
Yeah, what we discovered is that, well, let me back up a little bit. When you read the statute, our view was that the statute is a little confused about standards and guidelines and tended to use them interchangeably. We spent a lot of time reading and rereading the statute, trying to figure out whether Congress really meant something different by standards and guidelines. Finally concluded they didn't. The Forest Service early on had started out distinguishing between standards and guidelines. What had happened as we progressed with planning was that increasingly the actual plans that came out blurred the distinction between standards and guidelines, just like the statute did. You could pick a typical 1982 rule plan off the shelf, and you'd find a section called Standards and Guidelines. And it would have a bunch of items in there. And you would read through those, and you look at these items and try to figure out whether any particular item was to be interpreted as a standard or a guideline. And you'd say, well, did they use will or shall or should? And you start looking at the grammar to try to figure out whether this was a standard or a guideline. But further, what we discovered was that when you got down to the project level, it didn't make much difference anyway, because you figure out what made sense to do at the project level, and you would adopt those as requirements at the project. And if they were arguably inconsistent with the plan's standards and guidelines, then you would just do a site-specific amendment of the plan standards and guidelines to bring the plan in conformance with the project. So we started out writing the 2005 rule with kind of a catch-all standards and guidelines, and we discovered that mostly due to our earlier attempts to distinguish between standards and guidelines, that other people were still clinging to that distinction. So for clarity, we tried writing the rule just for guidelines. The other issue we ran into is that people who clung to the earlier distinction on standards viewed standards as prohibitions, absolute prohibitions, final decisions. They would view a standard with respect to, say, off-road vehicle use as a final decision that would require NEPA compliance. So we said, just to make sure that there's no confusion in this rule, we wrote the rule for guidelines. But we've left the door open all along. If people wanted to include standards in that special sense of standards as absolute prohibition, they can do that under the 2005 rule. We know there's a substantial body of opinion out there that would like to see standards explicitly recognized in the 2005 rule or in the next iteration of the 2005 rule. So we put that out there for an option to draw comment on that. It's very possible that we would incorporate standards in that very special sense of standards as prohibitions.
So those would then be binding decisions at the plan level?
They would be in standards at the plan level, if we use the word standards in that sense of creating final decisions on binding prohibitions, would probably create a requirement for NEPA disclosure at that point, at the time the plan were adopted. So does that get at your question about what our thinking was?
But also to add, its bindingness was always based on not having a project with a site-specific plan amendment. So
That's right.
Just so everyone's really clear on that, just because you had a standard didn't mean that 100% of projects all the time actually use that standard.
So
Take for example, under the 82 rule, you could have something in your plan and you could call it a standard that no road can come within 100 feet of a stream unless it's going to cross the stream. Well, that's a binding standard, it's a final decision, and you would recognize that influence your EIS. But when you actually went out there on the ground to lay out a specific project, if the ground dictated that the best place to put the road was closer than 100 feet, what you do now is you do a site-specific plan amendment as part of the project level decision to deviate from that standard. So as a practical matter, we've always viewed the distinction between standards and guidelines as somewhat artificial, and that's why they got increasingly blurred in the plans we were doing under the 82 rule.
I mean, the metaphor that always comes to mind is I always wish I could get 50 local land use planners and 50 Forest Service planners together in a room, because you do a lot of the same stuff in slightly different ways. To them, that's a variance. And for them, variances are things they do all the time, but they do pursuant to very specific process, pursuant to whatever their local process happens to be. Some of them do it successfully, some of them don't.
Well, that's the same thing as us. We do them according to a very specific process, a site-specific NEPA process.
Right.
And sometimes we win and nobody appeals it and nobody litigates it, and sometimes we don't.
But it shows the importance of the standard, because if you don't have a standard, there's nothing from which to get a variance from.
If you're complying with your standards, things go ahead pursuant to sort of record-keeping requirements. If you are deviating from your standard, then there have to be procedures in place to notify relevant parties, to do environmental analysis if necessary, to do hearings if necessary.
And I think that's a really, I mean, Fred probably knows better than I do, but I think that's a really important, what the point you just made is just really, really important, because under the new regs, you would still, and say it was a guideline compared to a standard, you just still have to look at it in your NEPA document, and you still have to say, hey, this is a guideline for my plan, but I'm not going to follow it here because it doesn't make any sense. The birds aren't here in July, or whatever the rationale is, really has to be in the decision document. But the difference would be that you would have to be litigated, I guess, on something like arbitrary and capricious instead of not following that standard. So for a lot, is that right, Fred?
Yeah, I think that's right. As a practical matter, the documentation you're going to have to provide in the project level analysis to deviate from a guideline, I think is going to be indistinguishable from the documentation you're going to have to provide for deviation from a standard. As a practical matter, for the analysis, for the NEPA disclosure, I don't think it makes a difference. Now, whether it makes a difference in your ability to litigate the project, I would leave to the attorneys to tell me.
Well, but I think that the reality we all know is that you have very limited resources and a whole lot of land. And I think what happened any number of times under the 1982 rule is folks in the Forest Service made choices about where you were going to put those resources, those analytical resources about particular deviations from the planning process. I'm not saying you didn't have to make those choices. I think you did, because as we all know, a lot of those plans were out of date in a year or 2 years. But you were scrambling around saying, well, that one's going to slide. Nobody's going to worry about that one. And then, I got so much budget. I got so many people I can do to deal with riparian damage, I'm going to throw it at that one because people drive that road. And that kind of process is perfectly rational. It drives lawyers absolutely insane because there's no way we can, or the lawyers who represent you can, draw a legal distinction between the stream you didn't do the analysis for and the stream you did. Because the distinction you drew was based on your understanding of the landscape and your expertise as scientists and land managers, and not on the law.
Now, I understand the dilemma, but I don't know how you cookie cutter this stuff. Because every project's unique.
Yeah.
There is an additional problem which you alluded to earlier, which is the decentralized nature of the Forest Service means that similar things get done differently in different units. That creates dilemmas for the attorneys. It creates dilemmas for management as well. And it's how you decide what's the right level of standardization across the Forest Service is an ongoing challenge for us.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the kind of creative discussion we should be having. Is face it, you're subject to a statute which is like the last survival of the Soviet era, right? You're preparing 15-year plans to manage forests for resource management. In 1976, it kind of made sense. But that's what we have now, and how can we do it? On the other hand, you have technological capacities to survey land types, to inventory resources, which nobody had imagined in 1976. And so you're right, you can't cut cookie cutter. Everything on the land is unique. Everything on the land will always be unique. But are there places we can go? Are there standards that can be written? Are there ways you can write standards that allow you to do the right thing almost all the time and be pretty sure you have the resources to deviate when you need to? Not the right thing, the standard says most of the time.
So why isn't that a guideline?
Because of the process part, right? We're lawyers, we live and die by process. Is that if it's a standard and you deviate from it, you have to maybe do NEPA analysis.
No, we do. We would either way if it was a guideline or a standard.
Sometimes you didn't, sometimes you didn't.
We didn't do NEPA at all for a project?
No, you did NEPA. I mean, this is the right. I don't want to get into.
Would we have done a site-specific amendment to the forest plan for a standard that we deviated from or had a variance versus, or a guideline versus a standard?
But the paperwork, and I guess that's, as a practitioner, the paperwork is about the same. Yeah.
Yeah, the analysis of, that's my point. Whether you call it a standard or a guideline, the analysis you're going to do is going to be the same, because so it's not going to make any difference in how the project comes out. It makes a difference in how you characterize what was done. I got a comment earlier on the era in which this was adopted. It wasn't all that long ago that The Economist magazine called the Forest Service the last bastion of Stalinist economics in the United States. Because of that complicated planning process that we had.
Right, and that's not you, that's Congress, right? You're the last bastion of the progressive era in the United States, and you've got a lot of history to be proud of. But the National Forest Management Act can be a little awkward.
Maybe it would be helpful, again, an example thing to actually show you, like a document that deviates from a guideline document with a site-specific plan amendment.
Sure.
So you could just see what, get a visceral idea of how much paperwork that is.
Yeah, but the thing is, you can change it.
You can change it either way.
Right, but NEPA is your friend, right? You get to a significant degree decide how NEPA gets complied with, right? And once you do, you are entitled to lots and lots of deference, right? Because you are the experts, and we are not. And that's the way it should be.
I want to bring in maybe a specific issue and see if we can't sort of better understand how you see the planning process working in the context of species, wildlife species, and diversity issues. And maybe we can tie NEPA into this and monitoring into this a little bit, because I think it's all related. You know, one of the concerns, Fred, with the way you describe planning, this sort of iterative process, is if you start with an idea, a concept, and you don't look at other, if you don't open your mind to other possibilities, radically different possibilities, you're not really thinking outside the box about what the possibilities are. If the old plan was flawed and you tweak it, the new plan will be maybe a little bit better, but still arguably flawed. You know, the whole point of NEPA, the alternatives analysis, was supposed to be the heart of the environmental impact statement. It was supposed to, you know, set out your choices in a kind of matrix form so you could have a clear basis for choice among the options. And you may not have liked the way the Medicine Bow planning process worked, but we all knew that you weren't going to choose the conservation biology alternative, and we sure prayed and hoped you weren't going to choose the timber production alternative that may have been proposed by the industry folks. We knew it was going to come down somewhere in the middle, but that doesn't mean it's not useful as a sort of planning tool, as a way to think broadly at looking at these other options. And so, for example, in the wildlife context, you know, if you have a conservation biology alternative, hopefully you're looking at things like wildlife corridors, and you can say, okay, you know, our old plan didn't think in those terms, but there's actually this corridor here that might work. You know, the environmental groups have come up with this corridor, and you know, we could actually probably fit this into our plan. We might have to do a little tweaking here and tweaking there. All of a sudden, you've learned something from that process. Maybe the timber industry is really focused on one particular area that maybe the environmental community doesn't care that much about, and in fact, you could increase logging in that area. I think the whole point of going through this exercise was to learn something about the way in which you might change your plan, maybe fundamentally, to bring it up to sort of current thinking. And I worry that the tweaking process, the sort of iterative process that you describe, is taking us away from the goal of NEPA. You know, I understand that NEPA is hard a lot of times. It's not easy, it's time consuming, it's expensive. I'm sympathetic to the problem that you have in dealing with it, but the compliance, you know, if the 2005 rule is any example, the compliance effort is so half-hearted that it almost is meaningless. I'd almost rather you didn't do, I know you had to do it for the court order unless you appealed, but you know, it wasn't very helpful for me to read your EIS and the 2005 planning rule. Maybe you didn't believe in it, you felt like you just had to do it, it was a rote exercise, but that message is communicated to the public. When all you're doing is going through the motions of preparing a document because the court orders you to do it, I mean, I think we sense that. We can see that in the document that comes out of it. And there doesn't really feel like there's an effort to engage us on new thinking on planning, how to do this. All right, you don't like the 2005 rule, we don't like the 82 rule or the 2000 rule. What do you got in your little box that might be different? I mean, setting out those other two old rules as the main alternatives to your 2005 rule, to me, was an insult. We all knew you weren't going to choose those. I mean, you haven't done it yet, but you're not going to choose those alternatives. And I personally, I don't think you should. I think there are problems with those old approaches. And so I'm sympathetic to your need to make some changes. But that doesn't mean that the 2005 rules or a few minor tweaks on your 2005 rules are the only way to think about planning. And as we talked about it, you know, it may be that the way you're doing it is much more consistent with the way I'd like to see it done than I'm giving you credit for. But that's not how I read your 2005 rules, and it's going to depend on how other administrators decide to implement those rules down the road. So I mentioned I wanted to bring in monitoring, and I hope we can talk about that.
Can I comment on the EIS, because that's come up several times. You know, as on the alternatives specifically,
yeah.
82 and the 2000 rule are both included. They're both argued with a no action alternative in this case. There is a school of thought that says the 2000 rule is the no action alternative. There's a school of thought that says it's the 82. We have in fact come down on the 2000 rule as being the no action alternative, but we've included the 82 rule in there to respond to those people who believe that it is the appropriate baseline for comparing subsequent rules. The plaintiffs in the California case asked the judge to reimpose the 82 rule, and the judge declined to do that, so it's up to the Forest Service to figure out what rule is still in effect at this point. In terms of writing EISs on rules, I actually think it's very hard to write a meaningful EIS on a rule that establishes a process. It's very hard to talk about what the substantive outcome on the ground is going to be as a result of adopting a different process at arriving decisions about the ground. When the 2000 rule was actually came through, when it was adopted, what was written for that was an EA, not an EIS. And I'd invite you to read that and compare that with what was done. When the 82 rule was adopted, it was done with an EA, which tiered to the EIS that was done for the 79 rule. And I would invite you to read the EIS for the 79 rule and see how specific they were able to be about what the consequences on the ground were going to be for the alternative planning processes they looked at. So I actually think that our EIS is appropriate for the decision that's actually being made in the adoption of the process. Now, it's an entirely separate matter of whether there are other alternatives that we should have looked at in that EIS. And my response here would be is, you know, looking at alternative planning goes back to actually 1989. In 1989, the Forest Service financed through, I believe it was Indiana University, a critique of planning. Yeah. And which looked at all our experience today, collected suggestions on how to do different kinds of plans. And we floated alternative views of how to do planning in all those draft rules that came out that I cited earlier in 92, 97, 99. There was a committee of scientists that was around in the late 90s, which also floated some views on planning. So I think the alternative views of planning have been thrashed for out there, have been debated for a long time, I mean, for well over a decade now. It's we don't know of any good solution that's out there that's unexamined so far, and certainly none have been suggested. We are open to that, but we're still struggling with that essential problem. How do we can get plans done in a reasonable amount of time for a reasonable amount of cost that incorporate science and let people be involved? There may be a better way, and if there is a better way, we'd certainly like to hear it.
Well, I would like to mention, Roop, unfortunately, is not here, but the idea of getting involved with community planners, that's exactly what the small group did. There's something called the forest planning model. Is that what it's called now, Fred? The model?
I don't know, prototype.
Yeah, it used to be called the prototype, but that's basically what it was, and that was the origination of the three-part plan: the vision, the strategy, and the design criteria. And John, actually, we should probably set up something with him at some time, because that's what that group did, is went back and talked to community planners and tried to incorporate some of those latest ideas from the planning community.
I mean, I'll say two things, one real negative and one real positive. The real positive thing is I think the vision approach makes a lot of sense, because I think it resolves a lot of immediate disputes and brings a lot of people together. The negative thing is there's a fundamental difference between where you were in 1979 and where you are now on doing a NEPA analysis and planning, which is you have a mountain of data, right? If anybody in the world knows if dreaded regulation 219.19 actually did anything, you do, because you prepared 154 plans pursuant to or whatever the number is, pursuant to the 1982 rules, and did some monitoring on those plans. And while the philosophical aspects of planning are laid out in this EIS, the data associated with what effect, if any, compliance with guidelines and standards actually had on the environment, on the forest, is not.
But that's not necessarily a planning, an NFMA planning thing. If the projects were good, that would have to do with good project planning too, wouldn't it? How could you separate out those effects?
No.
Well, let me talk about, I mean, this idea of a desired future condition or a vision. And just think of the Front Range out here. So you got the Front Range of Colorado, and it's fundamentally, ecologically, much of the Front Range is outside its range of natural variation, and it's not healthy. There's too many ponderosa pine on an acre, on a given acre in this arid climate than nature would have, had fire been playing its natural role in this over the eons, and man had not put fire out and done the other things we've done in this system. So if you sit down with a set of folks, including neighbors, and you show them a picture of the pre-white man inhabitation of the Front Range, or as close as we can when photographs came into being, you would see a very open, something like 12 to 16 trees per acre, and now we got 200 to 2,000 trees per acre. Okay. Now, you'd sit there and you'd have this conversation with a set of a subdivision, and you'd say, see that hillside outside your picture window? Well, here's what it would look like under the best we can mimic a natural process. 12 to 16 trees per acre. I would say most people, I would guess, many people go, my God, we need more trees than that. That didn't even look like a forest. And so you'd say, okay, well, and you can model with technology, okay, well, let's put 50 trees per acre and 100, and you have these different pictures, aspirational, desired future, vision pictures of what it would look like. If you can get agreement on that, then your plan, then your project implementation is all about, and what you're monitoring is, are we moving that piece of land to that desired future that the public has agreed on? And I would tell you that is far more productive in my experience, and it's far easier to have an intelligent discussion with people about that than a lot of the esoteric. Now, you're all attorneys, or going to be. My son just graduated from DU Law School, so I have an investment too in this business. But I would say that dialogue and that agreement around what that ought to look like, that piece of land, and the suite of species that go with that, and how much water would run off of that chunk of country and all that, is far more in keeping, I think, with what the framers of NFMA really were talking about. And so the dialogue about standards and yes, I like alternatives as a means to paint the picture. It could be this, it could be that, it could be this. But I'm just saying that was, in my opinion, as sort of a practitioner, decision maker in this world, that was one of the most appealing things, is one of the most appealing things about the 05 rule. It changes the dialogue to more about that and less about warring factions lobbying for a certain alternative, and then untold amounts of analysis and data about a bunch of alternatives that you aren't even going to select ultimately, and all of that cost. And I'd rather have the discussion, let's agree on the desired future, then let's figure out how we can get there. How do you move to that desired future?
Well,
so
let me add something to. I agree with what you said, Rick, totally. But let me come back to this data. You know, logically, you could argue that what the data would show is that planning is irrelevant. If you looked at the EIS, all those EISs that were done, and you looked at what they projected was going to happen to the forest, and then you went and looked at what actually happened to the forest, you would find they were radically different. Because we didn't do those activities, we didn't deal with things the way the plan expected we would deal with things. It would be hard to prove logically that the forest would look any different today if we'd never done those plans from data. Now, we all know that, we all believe that the planning exercise has been worthwhile because it's forced us to improve our understanding of what's going on out there, but the data won't show